I was just so desperate to get out of being so exhausted and so stressed and just needing some sort of escape. I was like, well, that also sounds really good and something that I'd be interested in. So it really wasn't until I really started looking into it for myself that I was like, man, I could be making over $100,000 a year eventually once I turn out. The education's provided, free tools, free books and stuff. Of course, that's specific to IBEW Local 48 here in Portland, Oregon. But it was just such an awesome opportunity that I couldn't pass it up. I had to try.
What inspired you to even get on this electrician journey? Because I know a lot of people have a hard time choosing a trade. That's something that we try to help people with through our mentorship program, kind of helping them pick a trade. But what inspired you to get into it, and what kind of gave you the nudge to push past it and get into your apprenticeship program?
I grew up in a family where my dad is actually a tradesman. He's with Local 280, the Plumbers and Pipe Fitters Union, or I'm sorry, 290 here in Portland, Oregon. And so I grew up knowing that at least being a plumber or a pipe fitter was a good route to go in terms of being able to provide for your family. But I never really saw that as something that I was interested in. So I never really thought about pursuing any of the other trades. And so early on in my life after high school, I found myself working at AT&T as a store manager after a few years of working my way up. So I was working at AT&T about 46 hours a week salary. So I wasn't getting paid extra for the extra 6 hours I was putting in, even though it ended up being a lot more than that. And then I was also working part-time at another job, and I was just so busy with work. And I had my oldest daughter, she was just born, and I just didn't have any time with my family or anything. And so I kind of realized I got to do something else to where I can make more and hopefully work less. And at the same time, I was talking to my brother-in-law, Tim. He's a general foreman out in IBEW Local 46 in Seattle, Washington, and just kind of talking with him back and forth and being in a position where I was just so desperate to get out of being so exhausted and so stressed and just needing some sort of escape. I was like, well, that also sounds really good and something that I'd be interested in. So it really wasn't until I really started looking into it for myself that I was like, man, I could be making over $100,000 a year eventually once I turn out. The education's provided, free tools, free books and stuff. Of course, that's specific to IBEW Local 48 here in Portland, Oregon. But it was just such an awesome opportunity that I couldn't pass it up. I had to try. And so, yeah, I went after it and gave it everything I had, and I made it in.
What was the time frame between you deciding you were going to do it and getting into the apprenticeship program?
When I was first interested, it had to have been, I want to say it was maybe a few months before they started accepting applications. I was doing my research and studying for my aptitude test well before I had even applied. Now, when they started accepting applications, they were doing it on a specific day of the month. And so I turned in my application, and then a month after that is when I was scheduled for my aptitude test, which I had already been preparing for. And I talk about that in a video that I have. I used an app called Khan Academy that helped. And then after my aptitude test, it took another month to have my interview scheduled. And then after my interview and I got my rank, 3 months after that is when I started. Basically 6 months from applying to finally getting in is what it took.
Since we're on the topic, kind of going in that line, the first step is really to get prepared for your aptitude test. Or would you say there's another step before that? For anyone who doesn't know kind of like the exact steps here.
Definitely the first thing is do your research on the trade, because I think a lot of people have an idea of what it's going to be, and then they get into it and they find out like, oh, this is nothing like I thought it was going to be. Do your research, talk to people that you know that are in the trade, watch videos. That's another one of the reasons why I do this, is to let people know what it's like. And then once you know that you want to get in, then you really just want to, if you're going to go the IBEW route, you're going to want to look into when your local is accepting applications and find out what the requirements are, because you may need to take some extra classes to maybe improve like your overall math GPA from high school. Basically just making sure that you meet those requirements and then go and apply, and always be preparing for the next step. So always make sure that you're preparing for your aptitude test beforehand and thinking about interview questions and all that beforehand.
When you first started, did you have someone that kind of helped you along the way? Did you have someone to kind of mentor you or give you some kind of path to follow? Or were you just doing the solo YouTube education, like I'm just going to figure this out on my own?
I had my brother-in-law, Tim, who I could talk to, and he didn't go the same route that I went. He went with a non-union and then transferred into the union. So I could get some advice from him, but not the exact advice that I was looking for, even though he was great. But what was nice is that me and my brother, we were actually both going through the whole application process together. And he's an electrician also for Local 48. So the nice thing was I could take my aptitude test, he took his, and we kind of talked about, I had trouble with this, he had trouble with that. And we would kind of ask each other, how would you answer this interview question and whatnot. But in terms of having somebody guide me through the process, I really didn't have that.
Did you feel fairly confident going into these tests? with what you had access to at the time?
I would say that I did feel pretty confident, and I really just think that's because of how much time I spent preparing beforehand. One thing that I would do, and I talk about this in my aptitude test video, is when my oldest was still a baby, I would put her to sleep, and then I would basically just stay in her room while she was sleeping for like an hour every single night and just practice math problems and go over the things I needed to. And I made that like a normal routine. Every single week I would do that. And as far as practicing for my interview, during downtimes at AT&T, I would take out my phone and I would basically just answer on the voice recording app, my interview answer. And I would think of questions that they would ask and just over and over and over again, give the same answer until I had it down to an answer that I felt really confident in. And so I got to a point where I knew that if they asked me questions that in any way were similar to what I had practiced, that I would have been good. And thankfully they asked me, there was like one curveball question, but pretty much exactly what I had prepared for. And so I actually felt really confident leaving my interview. I didn't have the experience, but I could prove through my cover letter and my resume and documentation that I submitted that in every job I had kind of worked my way up to a position of management. So I was like, hey, here's the proof that you need that I'm going to be a hard worker, that I'm committed, and I'll do a good job. I think I had that going for me.
For kind of like a day in the life, would you work a full-time shift, come home, put your daughter to bed, stay up late, and then study? So how long were your days when you were like getting into that?
It was so busy. I would wake up and I'd probably be at work around 8:15, open up the store. On days that I would open, hopefully I would get out there at 6 p.m., but a lot of times there'd be customers or issues that I'd have to deal with, so I'd stick around late. Get home, eat, try to spend some time with my wife, put my girl to bed, and study for the test. There were days that I had off between the two jobs, but a lot of times on those days I would have conference calls that I'd have to be on, or employees call me and saying, hey, what do we do in this situation? And so again, that was just like the nudge that I needed to find something else that I could do with my life to make some good money and something that I'd enjoy.
The reason I ask is because that's kind of like a common thread amongst everyone that I chat with. The stories typically like they're doing something that maybe they don't enjoy as much, and then they look at the trades like, man, this is something that I could enjoy, get paid really well, and potentially change my life.
Yeah, and there's always something. You're never going to be in a situation where it's like, this is going to be so convenient right now for me to go through this process and get in. It's like, if you don't have time, you have to make time. If you have to stay up late, stay up late. If you have to get up early, do that. If you have to cut things out, then you have to do that. And same with when you first get into an apprenticeship as a young apprentice, you're not going to be making obviously as much money as you are once you turn out. And so there's a lot of people, like my brother, for example, he was making $33-ish an hour, and he ended up taking a pay cut all the way down to $16 an hour. It was tough because he had already had his house, and they just had to make some sacrifices and use some savings and do whatever they could to make it work. I've asked him in a video that I filmed and even recently, and he's just so happy that he made those sacrifices because it really paid off.
Those kinds of sacrifices when people are, because that's what's going to hold most people back is taking that leap. What would be some advice you would give someone who's like on that edge and is like, man, I don't know if I could take a half, like a 50% cut? What kind of got you through, or your brother, those kinds of situations?
Well, in my case, I had to ask myself, is it more worth it to take a pay cut and make these sacrifices for the short term? Or is it more worth it for me to keep working a job that is just so stressful and I have no time for my family and basically just never have time for anyone or anything that I wanted? But you really have to sit down, write things down, talk with your significant other, and make sure that you can make it work. But in most cases, there's going to be things that you can rearrange to make it happen. And look at your life now and look at your life where you could be after you make those sacrifices. And once you're finally there, and it's like, I think in most situations, it's going to be worth the sacrifice. And it's so hard to see that in the moment, but it really is.